The air in the dusty saloon was thick with the smell of stale whiskey, sweat, and cheap cigar smoke. Silas Blackwood sat alone at a corner table, nursing a beer, the day's grime still settled in the lines of his hands. He was a man of quiet fortitude, his face weathered by the Texan sun, his movements deliberate. He wasn't looking for trouble. He was just washing away the dust of a long day mending fences. That peace shattered when the saloon doors swung open with a violent slam. Jedediah Thorne stood silhouetted against the dying afternoon light, a man built like a side of beef, his butcher's apron stained with more than just animal blood. The low murmur of conversation died instantly. Jed's eyes, small and cold like a pig's, scanned the room and locked onto Silas. He stomped across the sawdust-covered floor, his heavy boots making the floorboards groan. "Blackwood," he growled, his voice a low rumble. "I hear you told Miller I handle my blade like a clumsy child." Silas looked up slowly, his expression unreadable. He hadn't said any such thing, and he knew it. This was a pretext, a spark Jed was trying to fan into a fire. "I don't recall that conversation, Jed. I've got no quarrel with you." "You do now," Thorne sneered, leaning over the table, his foul breath washing over Silas. "You insulted my honor. I demand satisfaction. Dawn tomorrow, pistols." The silence in the room was absolute. Everyone knew what this meant. Jed didn't duel for honor, he dueled to kill. He enjoyed it. Silas met his gaze without flinching. "No," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I won't draw on a man over a phantom insult. It's a fool's errand." Jedediah's face contorted with rage. He had been publicly denied his sport. "Coward," he spat, the word echoing in the tense quiet. "You're a yellow-bellied coward, Blackwood." Silas rose slowly from his chair, his tall frame unfolding. He was leaner than Jed, but there was a strength in him forged from hard work, not brute force. "Think what you will," Silas said, placing a coin on the table for his beer. "I have a ranch to run. I don't have time for your games." He turned and walked out of the saloon, the weight of every eye in the room on his back. He didn't see the venomous hatred in Jed's eyes, the silent promise of a retribution far crueler than a simple duel. He only felt the cool evening air on his face as he mounted his horse, a knot of unease tightening in his stomach. The first hint of dawn was just a faint, gray promise on the eastern horizon when Silas was torn from a shallow, restless sleep. It wasn't a sound that woke him, but a smell, acrid and sharp, the scent of burning pine and something else, something sickeningly familiar, scorched hair and flesh. His eyes snapped open. For a heart-stopping second, he lay paralyzed, the saloon's tense atmosphere replaying in his mind. Then, a sound pierced the morning quiet, a frantic, high-pitched screaming that wasn't human. It was the sound of pure terror, the sound of his animals. He threw off the thin blanket and was out the cabin door in an instant, his bare feet hitting the cold, damp earth. The sight that met him stole the air from his lungs. His barn, the structure he'd built with his own hands, was a roaring inferno. Flames licked greedily at the Montana sky, devouring the timber frame and turning the pre-dawn darkness into a hellish, flickering orange. Thick, black smoke billowed upwards, carrying with it the dying cries of the cattle and the two horses trapped within. "No!" The word was a raw, guttural cry of anguish. He sprinted towards the blaze, the heat hitting him like a physical blow. He reached for the large barn doors, his mind screaming to pull them open, to give the animals a chance. But the wood was already glowing cherry red, the metal latch too hot to touch. He recoiled, his hands singed, the pain a distant echo compared to the agony in his chest. He could hear them thrashing inside, their panic a symphony of horror that would be seared into his memory forever. He was helpless, utterly, devastatingly helpless. He could only stand and watch as the roof groaned under the fire's assault and collapsed inward with a deafening crash, sending a shower of sparks into the air. The terrible screaming from within abruptly ceased, replaced by the roar and crackle of the fire. The silence that followed was more profound and horrifying than the noise it replaced. Silas stumbled back, his legs giving way. He fell to his knees in the dirt, his body trembling uncontrollably. Tears streamed down his face, mixing with the soot that was already beginning to settle on his skin. Everything, his work, his savings, his future, was turning to ash before his eyes. But it was the loss of the animals, living creatures he had cared for daily, that shattered him. It was a senseless, brutal slaughter. As the sun finally broke over the mountains, casting long shadows across the desolate scene, the fire began to subside, leaving the smoldering, skeletal remains of his livelihood. The shock slowly receded, and in its place, a cold, hard certainty began to form in the pit of his stomach. This was no accident. This was not a stray spark or a tipped lantern. This was a message. He saw Jedediah Thorne's face in his mind, the sneer twisting his lips, the promise of retribution in his cold eyes. "You'll regret this." The butcher's words echoed in the silence, no longer a vague threat, but a fulfilled prophecy of ruin. The sun was a merciless eye in the vast Montana sky, casting long, stark shadows across the valley as Silas walked the 2 miles to redemption. Each step was a heavy, deliberate act, a testament to the iron will that was all he had left. His clothes, stiff with soot and the stench of smoke, were a dark shroud against his skin. His face, a mask of grime streaked by the tears he'd shed in the pre-dawn gloom, was set like stone. He didn't feel the sharp pebbles on the road through the worn soles of his boots. He felt only the hollow ache in his chest, where a lifetime of work used to be. As he entered the town's main street, a hush fell over the usual morning bustle. A blacksmith's hammer paused mid-swing. Women carrying baskets to the general store stopped, their whispers dying on their lips as they saw him. They saw the ruin etched on his face, the ghost of fire in his clothes. Their eyes, wide with a mixture of pity and fear, flickered away as soon as they met his. They knew. They didn't need to see the smoldering ashes of his barn to understand what had happened or who was responsible. Their silence was a verdict in itself, an acknowledgement of Jedediah Thorne's power and their own helplessness. Silas ignored them, his gaze fixed on the small, unassuming building at the end of the street, the sheriff's office. He pushed the door open, a small bell announcing his arrival with a frail jingle that sounded utterly out of place. Sheriff Miller looked up from his paperwork. He was a man worn down by his office, his face a roadmap of compromises and small defeats. He took in Silas's appearance, and the professional calm on his face faltered. He stood slowly, his expression grim. "Silas," he said, his voice low, "heard a commotion from out your way, figured I'd be seeing you." "He burned it, Sheriff," Silas said, his own voice raspy, raw from smoke and grief. "He burned it all. My barn, my livestock, everything." Miller sighed, a weary, familiar sound. He motioned to a chair, but Silas remained standing, a pillar of righteous fury. "You mean Thorne?" It wasn't a question. "You know I do. He threatened me in front of half the town last night. Now my ranch is a graveyard. That's not a coincidence." "An accusation is one thing, Silas. Proof is another," Miller said, leaning against his desk. "Did you see him? Did anyone see him light the fire?" "It was before dawn. Who would have seen him?" Silas's voice cracked, frustration warring with his exhaustion. "His threat is the proof. He was humiliated, and he made me pay for it. Jed was seen at the saloon late, and I'd wager my badge he made sure someone saw him back at his shop early this morning," Miller countered, his tone laced with a tired pragmatism. "He's a monster, but he isn't a fool. It's your word against his. Without a witness, my hands are tied. I can't arrest a man like Thorne on a hunch. It would tear this town apart." Silas stared at the sheriff, the last ember of hope for lawful justice dying within him. He saw not a protector of the peace, but a manager of it, a man more concerned with preventing further trouble than punishing a past crime. Miller wasn't corrupt. He was simply beaten. He was afraid, just like everyone else. Without another word, Silas turned and walked out, leaving the sheriff standing alone in his quiet, orderly office. He stepped back into the harsh sunlight, the averted gazes of the townspeople now feeling less like pity and more like complicity. The law was a shield for the powerful, not a sword for the wronged. He was on his own. His eyes found the butcher shop down the street, its windows like vacant eyes. The quest for justice had just begun, and it would not be fought with badges or courts. Silas stepped out of the sheriff's office, the midday sun forcing him to squint. The heat rising from the dusty street felt different now, not the familiar warmth of a day's work, but a sterile, indifferent glare. The raw, gut-wrenching grief from the morning was beginning to cool, hardening into something else. Something colder, sharper. He understood now. Walking in and confronting Thorn with a gun would be suicide, a fool's errand that would only end with him dead and Thorn hailed as a man defending himself. Miller was right about one thing. Thorn had to be undone, not just killed. He had to be unwoven from the fabric of redemption itself. He walked down Main Street, but not as a man heading home. He was a predator learning his new hunting ground. He saw things he'd never paid much mind to before. He saw how the owner of the general store, Mr. Abernathy, flinched slightly as one of Thorn's hulking assistants swaggered past. He saw the prime cuts of meat displayed in the window of Thorn's butcher shop, knowing other ranchers were forced to sell to Thorn at rock-bottom prices. The fear wasn't just in the saloon or in dark alleys. It was in every transaction, every averted gaze. Thorn's power wasn't in his fists, it was in his ledger. And that's when a name surfaced in his mind, Elias Vance, an old tanner who worked out of a small, pungent workshop by the creek. A few years back, Elias had the contract for all the hides from the biggest ranches, including Silas's own. Then, almost overnight, Thorn had muscled in, offering deals the ranchers couldn't refuse and leaving Elias with scraps. People whispered that Thorn had threatened Elias' family, but no one ever dared say it aloud. Elias was a proud, quiet man who had been publicly broken. He might be too scared to help, but he, more than anyone, would know where Thorn's financial skeletons were buried. Silas found Elias' tannery tucked away behind the livery stable, the sharp, chemical smell of curing hides hitting him from 20 yards out. The place looked neglected, the wood on the vats gray and splintered. Elias, a wiry man with leathered skin and defeated eyes, was scraping a meager deer hide, his movements slow and methodical. He looked up as Silas's shadow fell over him, his expression wary. "Blackwood," he grunted, not stopping his work. "Elias," Silas said, his voice even. "Heard you might have some work. I've got hides to spare." Elias stopped, finally looking at him. Pity flickered in his eyes. "I heard about your barn, Silas. I'm sorry, truly." "Thorn did it," Silas said flatly. There was no point in dancing around it. "Sheriff won't move without proof." Elias let out a bitter, humorless laugh. "Proof? Against Jedediah Thorn, you'll find gold nuggets in the creek bed first. The man owns this town." "He doesn't own you," Silas countered, stepping closer. "Not all of you. He took your business, Elias. He threatened you. I know he did. He burned my life's work to the ground for a slight to his pride. How long until he decides he wants this little patch of land you're on? How long do we let him feed on us?" Elias' hands trembled slightly. "What are you asking, Silas? You want me to stand up and call him out? He'd kill me before sunset." "No," Silas said, his voice lowering to a near whisper. "I'm not asking you to fight him. I'm asking you to help me find a pen. A ledger. A shipping manifest he falsified. A contract he broke. Anything. One loose thread is all it takes to unravel the whole damn tapestry." He let the words hang in the acrid air. Elias stared at his worn, stained hands, the scraper lying forgotten beside them. He was a man trapped between a lifetime of fear and a sudden, dangerous spark of hope. Silas had offered him a choice, and the weight of it seemed to settle on his slumped shoulders. Silas didn't press further. He had planted the seed. Now, he could only wait and see if it would take root in the scorched earth of Elias' fear. The late afternoon sun baked the dust of Redemption, Montana, into a fine, pale powder that coated everything. For Silas Blackwood, it was just another day of honest work. He'd spent the morning mending a stretch of fence on the north pasture, his hands, calloused and capable, working the wire with practiced ease. Now, leading his horse toward the general store, he felt a quiet satisfaction. His ranch wasn't the largest, but it was his. His cattle were healthy, his land was well tended, and he owed no man a thing. He was a man who believed in a simple creed: work hard, be fair, and keep to yourself. This creed had earned him a grudging respect in a town that often mistook quiet for weakness. That same sun cast long, menacing shadows from the awning of Jedediah Thorne's butcher shop. Inside, the air was thick with the coppery smell of blood and the sharp tang of brine. Thorne was a mountain of a man, his apron a permanent map of old and new stains. He wasn't just a butcher. He was a predator who had found a trade that suited his nature. He ruled his corner of the town through a combination of financial leverage and raw intimidation. Just that morning, he'd been berating a young farmer, Daniel, whose payment for a loan was a day late. "The interest compounds daily, boy," Thorne had sneered, his voice a low rumble. "Maybe your wife can work off some of the debt. I hear she's good with her hands." The farmer had paled, stammering an apology before scurrying away, utterly broken. The collision of Silas's principles and Thorne's cruelty was inevitable. It happened over a matter of business. Silas had brought two of his finest steers to market, animals he'd raised with care. Thorne, seeing the quality, made an offer, but it was insultingly low, a predator's price meant to exploit a need that Silas didn't have. "That's a fine price, Thorne," Silas said, his voice even but firm, "if the cattle were half-starved and sickly. But they're not." Thorne's eyes narrowed. No one spoke to him that way. "It's the price I'm offering. Take it or haul them back up the mountain." Silas didn't flinch. He looked Thorne directly in the eye, a gesture few men in redemption dared. "I'd rather they die of old age than sell them for a thief's price." He turned his back on the butcher, a simple act of refusal that, in the charged public space of the market, felt like a slap. Whispers rippled through the onlookers. Thorne's face turned a mottled shade of red, his fists clenching at his sides. He had been dismissed, his power publicly challenged not with a weapon, but with quiet dignity. It was an insult his ego couldn't absorb. As Silas led his cattle away, he could feel Thorne's gaze burning into his back. He didn't look back. He knew a line had been crossed. He had not sought conflict, but he had refused to be bullied. In a town like Redemption, that was more than enough to mark a man. The air, already hot and dry, now felt heavy with a promise of violence, waiting only for the right time and place to ignite. The late morning sun baked the dust of Redemption, Montana, into a fine, pale powder that coated everything. For Silas Blackwood, it was the dust of prosperity, settled on the thick, healthy coats of the 5 steers he guided down the main street. He moved with a quiet economy of motion, his face weathered by the same sun and wind that had shaped the landscape around him. His ranch, nestled in the foothills, was his life's work, and these animals were its finest product. He felt a familiar, humble pride as he approached his destination, Thorne's butcher shop. Jedediah Thorne stood in the doorway of his shop, a bloody apron stretched tight across his barrel chest. He was a mountain of a man, with small, dark eyes that missed nothing and seemed to find pleasure in the world's flaws. He watched Silas approach, a smirk playing on his lips. To Thorne, cattle weren't creatures to be raised, they were meat to be carved, profit to be extracted, and their owners were obstacles to be bullied into submission. Blackwood, Thorne's voice was a low rumble, like distant thunder, finally decided to bring that prime beef to a man who knows what to do with it. Silas nodded, his expression placid. "They're ready, Jed. Best I've raised." He ran a hand along the flank of the lead steer, a calm, reassuring gesture. Thorne walked around the animals, his gaze clinical and dismissive. He poked a thick finger into a steer's ribs, scoffing at the muscle beneath. After a cursory inspection designed more for show than assessment, he named a price. The figure was so low it was an insult, a clear attempt to strong-arm Silas, banking on the fact that few men in Redemption had the courage to question Jedediah Thorne. An expectant silence fell. A few townsfolk, sensing the tension, slowed their pace to watch. Silas didn't flinch. He looked from Thorne to his cattle and back again, his gaze steady. "That's not a fair price, Jed, and you know it," Silas said, his voice calm but firm. It carried no anger, only the simple weight of truth. "They're worth a third more. I'll find a buyer in Bozeman if I have to." Thorn's smirk vanished, replaced by a dark flush of fury creeping up his neck. He was not being challenged. He was being dismissed. Publicly, he took a half-step forward, his large hands clenching into fists. "You think you can walk into my town, in front of my shop, and spit on my offer?" "It's not your town, Jed," Silas replied, his voice still even. "And I'm not spitting on anything. I'm just stating a fact. The price is too low." With that, Silas gave a soft click of his tongue and a gentle tug on the lead rope. He began to turn his cattle around, leaving Thorn standing in the street, his authority shattered in plain sight. The butcher's eyes narrowed to slits, the humiliation burning like a hot brand. He watched Silas's back, the image of the principled rancher walking away seared into his mind. The matter wasn't settled. It was only beginning. The morning air was crisp and cold as Silas and Elia's Vance stood before Sheriff Miller's desk. The heavy, leather-bound ledger lay between them, an object of immense weight and danger. Miller, his face grim, turned the pages slowly, his finger tracing the fraudulent entries and extorted deals that had been Thorn's lifeblood. The evidence was undeniable, a meticulous record of greed and cruelty. "This is it, then," Miller said, his voice low but firm. He looked from the book to the two men, seeing not vigilantes, but citizens pushed to their limit. He won't come quietly. They found Thorn in front of his butcher shop, hacking at a side of beef with furious, heavy blows. He saw the sheriff approach, flanked by two newly deputized men, and his sneer was instantaneous. "Come to waste more of my time, Miller?" he growled, resting the cleaver on the blood-stained block. Miller didn't flinch. He stopped a few feet away, holding up the ledger. "Jedediah Thorn, this is your account book. It tells a story of theft, intimidation, and fraud." Thorn's eyes widened, first in shock, then in pure fury. He saw Silas and Elias standing at a distance, watching. The realization of how he'd been undone ignited a primal rage. "That spineless tanner," he roared, his knuckles white on the handle of his cleaver. "You think a book of numbers is going to stop me?" "It's over, Jed," Miller said, his hand moving to the pistol at his hip. "You've bled this town dry for the last time. You're under arrest for arson, among other things." With a guttural cry, Thorn lunged, not at the sheriff, but toward Silas, the cleaver raised. But he never made it more than 2 steps. Miller was faster. The sharp crack of a pistol shot echoed through the main street, and Thorn collapsed, clutching a bleeding shoulder and howling in pain and disbelief. The cleaver clattered onto the dirt street. Doors opened. Faces appeared in windows. The townspeople of Redemption, who had lived under the butcher's shadow for so long, watched as the deputies hauled the wounded, cursing man to his feet. His power, built on the fear he inspired, evaporated in an instant, leaving only a pathetic, bleeding bully. Silas watched him being dragged away, feeling no triumph, only a profound, somber exhaustion. He had not sought revenge but justice, and the cost had been immense. He turned to Elias, whose face was a mask of terror and overwhelming relief. The tanner met his gaze and gave a single, shaky nod. They had done it. Days later, Silas stood on the hill overlooking his ranch. The charred timbers of his barn were a black skeleton against the vast Montana sky. The smell of smoke still lingered, a constant reminder of his loss. But as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the valley, it was not the end he saw. It was a beginning. He had the land. He had his principles. And for the first time in a long while, the town of Redemption had hope. He took a deep breath of the clean, cold air and began to plan how he would rebuild.